For our COBT viewers and listeners, it's Maynard, Mike, and Jeff Tillery with something we're super excited about. Corey Rosenbusch is joining us. He's the president and CEO of the Fertilizer Institute. It's the trade organization that represents fertilizer manufacturers, distributors, service providers. It's a phenomenal organization. And as you all know, fertilizer, it kind of reminds me of shipping. It's one of those industries that is directly linked. At a minimum, it's a cousin of energy because it's so interwoven with energy economics and considerations. So we can't wait to get Corey's perspective and just understand what is broadly happening and incredibly important a part of the world, which is the fertilizer part of the world. So Corey, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. There are times I wish fertilizer wasn't so popular, but happy to talk about it.
Well, we're super excited. As I mentioned to you here in the quick pregame, just studying to be ready to talk to you has been fascinating. So we're really, thank you so much for joining. Mike, before we jump in with Corey, what would you tell us about the markets or anything else that's on your mind?
Well, I'd say today is a trifecta, right? We have bond yields are down, oil prices are down, stock market's up big. From a bond yield standpoint, the 10-year bond yield's around 4.65%. It kind of peaked out last week at 4.75% after the FOMC meeting. As far as the broader market, the Dow Jones is up about 1,000 points today, and that move today is really due to two key components. Caterpillar, who's roughly 300 points of that 1,000-point move, and Goldman Sachs, which is about 200 points of that move today. Obviously, Cat, they reported earnings this morning. They had blowout numbers and they had just record backlogs, and that's what's moving that stock today. So the basically generation space, the electricity space, that thematic theme seems to be flowing through today in Cat shares. As we think about, this week, key companies reporting, we have AMD, you have Disney, and you have Lilly. Tonight you have SpaceX, so that's going to create a lot of interesting momentum or no momentum on tomorrow. And we're, as you maybe recall, or maybe it's something new, but you're going to have a lockup coming here later this week with SpaceX shares. So it's going to be a really volatile week for SpaceX with reported earnings and with the lockups occurring. So that's where we are on that. As we already talked about, oil markets are down today. They're down, I think, $4 or $5 for the week. Only 2 days this week. They're down about $9 to $76 a barrel on WTI. And obviously, clearly, is this on and off war with Iran. Obviously, we're looking to negotiate some sort of agreement with them. Oil prices have come down, but it seems like on a weekly basis, this thing can change. And so hopefully we can be optimistic about it, but realize that we're on the tail end of that right now on the downside. So that's where we are. I'd say as far as the energy sector, I've been really surprised and really hopeful that the energy sector this week, with a $10 move down in oil prices, that the energy sector is down only 1.5%. That's a really good performance considering. Last week we mentioned that, it was going to be a big week for oil refiners, oil majors, and those results were really, really positive. They've talked about structural demand for refining being around for a lot longer than people expected, normalized margins being around for longer than expected. And we'll see how that plays out. And those stocks did very well. I'd say the one thing that kind of stood out to me from an earnings standpoint in energy this week is BP's earnings today. And, it really wasn't the earnings. It was really the CEO basically talking about it's prudent for them to start thinking to themselves, not as a super oil major. And really they should be thinking about themselves within their scale and their class of companies. And I thought that was like something that needed to be said. And it's something that's long overdue. And I think that will help them with their long-term strategy. So that was really interesting. As far as the earnings reporting this week in energy, you've got obviously BP already reported. You got Conoco, Diamondback Energy, Devon Energy, EOG, Helmerich and Payne, Marathon Petroleum, Williams, Phillips 66. I mean, just a lot of companies. So big earnings week for energy companies. The last thing I wanted to say is, and I was really thinking whether I should say this or not, but I'm going to say it anyways. The thing that really surprised me this week is President Trump coming out and basically talking about these super, majors, and particularly Chevron and Exxon, making too much money. He basically said he wasn't happy about it. that they're making too much money, that they should give some of the profits back to the public, and they better cut retail prices to consumers. That kind of shocked me a little bit, but I guess I can understand. Look, politically, that makes some sense. But, when I start looking at the oil majors, net profit margins in Q2 were fantastic, but they were mid to high double digits. And, in the last 3 years, they've been sort of high single to low double digits. Compare that to Microsoft, NVIDIA, Google, and Meta. Their average profit margins this quarter were around 40 to 45%. In the last 3 years, they've been 45 to 50%. So back to you, Maynard.
Jeff, what would you add before we jump in with Corey?
Thinking about whether it's the Caterpillar earnings today, some of the discussion over the last few weeks around what's going to happen over the next few years as the U.S. natural gas market grows significantly in terms of demand. To me, it's just worth kind of pausing and thinking back, put it in context with where we've come from. As you think about 5 years, U.S. demand for gas, we think grows order of magnitude 20 BCF cumulative over the next 5 years. It's interesting though, the next 5 years does look a lot like the last 5 years. We grew, the last 5 years just a little under 20 BCF cumulatively on the gas market. Majority of that being export driven. That's what looks to be the driver of the majority that goes over the next 5 years. We don't disagree with the sentiment and the theme in and around, or the belief in and around robust U.S. natural gas demand, but it is just important to put it in context. This is more of a continuation of what we've been doing for the last long while, as opposed to something new.
Awesome. Well, Corey, again, thank you so much for joining us. A mutual friend connected us. We've had fertilizer on our radar going back a number of years now. When I think about it, the first reason was the world just didn't really connect natural gas and fertilizer the way it should, at least the non-energy, non-fertilizer world. And then in 2022, when Russia-Ukraine hit and all the disruption that came with that, and honestly, a lot of the disruption that came with the net zero mentality around energy, there were just these problems showing up in the fertilizer world, which obviously affects food, which gets everybody's attention, food and farmers, really quickly. But it's a long way of saying welcome. We've been thinking about and wanting to do this for a while, so we're delighted to have you. Thanks for coming.
Well, and I want to jump in. I just want to go right into it here, right? Mike's comment was so fascinating to me because fertilizer's dealing with the same exact comment from the president. We about 2 months ago, well, 3 months ago, got the same tweet, stop making so much money. And just to get on a political soapbox, since I'm in Washington, D.C. for a second, managing populism right now in a political environment a few months out of the election, I'm in Virginia, today was a primary election day here in Virginia, has just become chaotic. And I never would have dreamed, we call it the horseshoe effect, right? That populism has driven the extremes on both parties to actually meet in a line. So we have Democratic senators introducing legislation to cap corporate profits, with a Republican president saying you're making too much money. This is in a free market, free enterprise country that is exhibiting more socialistic behavior than I have ever seen in my very short lifetime. And we are definitely experiencing that in the fertilizer industry as well, with comments like Mike just made, where same things happen to our industry. You've got government entities, government departments wanting to quote unquote take over and nationalize some of these assets. And we're just living in a really challenging time. And in some way, I kind of hope midterms get here quickly so we can perhaps get through some of this, what I hope is rhetoric. What I'm afraid of is that it's not rhetoric. It's a trend that's here to stay.
Well,
Sorry to jump right in there.
no, I think it is an important place to be. I think on our side, we had noticed it in the power world, where power is complicated. There's lots of things going on in power. Power prices have been going up. And the backdrop, like you said, is both parties have become more interventionist in their thinking. And so if they're going to be that way, then boy, they've got to understand it better if they're going to be involved. Would you mind, maybe as a primer, start with the fertilizer industry, some of the key inputs, some of the key producing regions, and in particular, some of the impacts of whether it's the Strait of Hormuz or anything else. Just talk to us a little bit about the foundation of your community.
It's a great story, Maynard, and feel free to interrupt as we kind of talk through fertilizer. It's often challenging to communicate about fertilizer because in many ways we are many different industries because fertilizer is not a single product like oil or gas might be. They are actually many different products. We sell over 40 plus different fertilizer products. We tend to kind of group them into three, although I suspect we'll spend a lot of time on a fourth one today, which is sulfur. But NPK, nitrogen, phosphate, and potash. So if you're fertilizing your lawn and you buy a bag of fertilizer from your local retail store, those three numbers represent the content of nitrogen, phosphate, and potash, just to make it real perhaps for a novice. And each of them have different characteristics, different markets. They're produced in different places around the world. They have different challenges from a business and regulatory standpoint. I'll start with nitrogen, which is, of course, the one most closely connected to your world as a natural gas derivative. A process was developed called Haber-Bosch, which basically takes the air full of nitrogen, but not something that can be consumed by a plant, chemically reacts it with natural gas, and that's what produces ammonia. And so ammonia is the building block for all nitrogen fertilizer. It can either be applied or upgraded into urea, UAN, ammonium nitrate. There are other nitrogen type fertilizers that can be upgraded into. We have a very competitive nitrogen industry in the United States because we have available and affordable natural gas. And that is the key feedstock, makes up anywhere from 80 to 90% of the production cost of ammonia fertilizer. And we import still about 13% or so of our nitrogen fertilizers, depending on which one we're talking about. If you flip to the other two, phosphate and potash are both mined materials. Phosphate mined, typically surface mined, and then that rock has to be converted into a usable form by the plant, which is done by reacting ammonia and sulfuric acid that produces what we call MAP and DAP. Those are the two most commonly used phosphate fertilizers. So it even has nitrogen and sulfur as two raw materials, even in a phosphate fertilizer. The last one is potash. By the way, on phosphate, we produce about 60% of the market share for a U.S. farmer here domestically. We import about 40%. China controls global phosphate production. They produce over 40% of total phosphate supply in the world. The other big players would be Morocco, Russia, etc. Saudi Arabia, can't leave out Saudi Arabia. And then potash, which is the last macronutrient, is also mined, but typically underground. There are some phosphate solar kind of facilities, such as the Great Salt Lake in Salt Lake City, where you evaporate the water and you're left with the salt and phosphate there, which is used more on specialty products. Most of the phosphate, though, is mined underground, as much as a mile underground. Fascinating process to see. And we only produce about 2% of total market demand for the U.S. grower here domestically. We import about 98%. About 85% of that import comes from Canada, a very friendly trading partner, I think, depending on what's going on that week. And then the other two large suppliers are Russia and Belarus. Russia and Belarus combined represent about 40% of the total global supply. So a key theme that we can come back to is you hear me talk about China, world's largest fertilizer producer, Russia, world's largest fertilizer supplier from an export standpoint, Belarus, Middle East, we are in the middle of some major geopolitical disruption in our space right now.
And would you mind those three flavors, the nitrogen, the phosphate, the potash, if I'm a U.S. farmer or agricultural, producer, how exposed am I to those flavors? Like, what are the market shares, if you will, of those three?
Yeah, so that's not an easy question because every crop needs all three, but in different times and different quantities. So we say corn is king because corn consumes about 50% of total crop nutrients in the United States. So when you think about the Midwest, the I states, that is where over half of all fertilizer ton gets applied. Corn is a heavy nitrogen producer, user, nitrogen, phosphate and potash. It today has some residual of that nutrient in the soil that can continue to be mined. But nitrogen has to be applied at time of planting. Even during planting, it is by far your widest used nutrient in the U.S. And it's all crops, cotton, rice. They will all use it. Soybeans are probably an exception from a nitrogen standpoint. As a legume, obviously they fix nitrogen, so you don't have to use nitrogen for soybeans.
And Corey, I know your background's really interesting. You were a Texas A&M guy like Jeff Tillery.
All right. You were like Jeff.
You were a Harvard Global Development Scholar. Also president of the Future Farmers of America at one point, which is really cool. But the other thing I noticed in your bio is that since you joined the Fertilizer Institute, like I think you guys have like 100 new members or something. The membership has really grown. That last piece of it, is that because the stresses in the fertilizer world have been going up and they've been feeling more of a need to discuss, or to what would you attribute the growth of the Fertilizer Institute?
Well, I'd like to say I could take credit for doing it.
I mean, the Corey fact.
We have a great team. We have a really great team. I think it's a concerted effort. We have really focused on going out into the marketplace, finding who we're missing, inviting them to be part of the organization. We're on the main stage now, and I think everybody wants to be a part of that. So I think that is definitely some of it, Maynard. I will be very transparent and say some of it came through what I would call acquisition. So we acquired the Biostimulant Association. Biostimulants are not necessarily a crop nutrient, but help the plant respond and take up nutrients more effectively and more efficiently. So, we got 50 or so new companies because of that. We acquired the Fluid Fertilizer Foundation, got a few new members through that. So some of it came through acquisition as well. So it's not really one thing over the other, but has definitely, and I would say even, some of the government interest in investing in these facilities has drawn in some new members as well.
And from your vantage point, it's really fascinating. So you're selling to farmers, which is a very important constituency. You have an input as energy, which has a lot of geopolitical volatility around it. And we've seen some of the tapes of you testifying in front of the Senate. Mike referenced it. Like, how are you explaining to people, and maybe you could touch on Hormuz in here. How are you explaining to people what has happened to the prices for fertilizer, how they should understand it, when they will go back down? Like, how what's the message you've been taking to Washington and to the public at large on prices?
Yeah, as an aside real quick, you describe, we take an energy product, natural gas, convert it into a fertilizer to convert it into a crop, which is then converted into a new energy source, i.e. E15. A third of all the corn in this country is as a fuel. So it's kind of ironic sometimes as you think about what we're doing, but anyways, that was an aside. It has been a really challenging time to explain fertilizer markets because they're not simple, they're not easy. And the farm economy, especially, is very challenged right now. Financially, the numbers are not adding up for growers. The price that they're receiving for their crops is not penciling for them to really invest in some of the inputs to grow the product. And I'd say that's what makes the current environment unique. If I look back to 2022, and we can talk about Russia invading Ukraine, and we had a even more extreme spike in prices in the marketplace. At least at that time, farmers had very high prices for their commodities. I shouldn't say high, favorable prices for their commodities. So, there was at least the ability to afford that increase in cost. Now it's the opposite, right? It's declining crop prices and increasing input prices, and so that has really confused the grower. It's created animosity even among the grower. And I had a conversation with a grower the other day. It's like, why? I don't understand why these prices are going up because of Iran when I've got a fertilizer plant 50 miles down the street. And this is just corporate greed, right? This is manipulation of the markets. And so it really, one, I would ask, I'm not even confident you're getting your product from that plant down the street. Unfortunately, because of the efficiency of the supply chain and the way the world works, there's a good chance that you're not even sourcing your fertilizer from there. You may likely be importing it from Russia because it's cheaper to do so. And then two, the global supply and demand message is really hard to communicate sometimes. And I think it's hard because when you think about the other inputs, like if you look at crop protection, or if you even look at a tractor for that matter, you have a cost of goods, right? The cost to manufacture that good, and then there's a margin that would be applied to sell that to the grower. And that is not the way fertilizer works. In many ways, we're identical to the farmer in that you may produce a product that is far more expensive to produce than what the market is that you can sell it for. And we're seeing that in phosphate right now because of the price of sulfur. The cost of sulfur far exceeds the price of selling MAP and DAP to the grower. So those manufacturers are starting to cut back on their production costs. And so that, you think that would be an easy thing to connect the dots to, because in some ways we are a commodity, but it always isn't that cut and dry. And so global supply and demand matters. We are in an environment globally right now where supply is very constrained all around the world. And oh, by the way, we're dealing with socialistic governments who are running state-owned enterprises and subsidizing their growers to buy their crop inputs. So, for example, India as a central government will buy all of their crop nutrients, their fertilizers, and then they will sell it at a highly subsidized cost to their billions of farmers in order to ensure food security and ultimately national security. So what they pay for it is really irrelevant because it's socialized. It doesn't have to make money for the farmer. So they will drive up the price of urea to $1,000 a ton just so they can get it. That's all India cares about. And that means in order for the U.S. farmer to attract those tons here, they're going to have to pay 1,000 tons for it.
And would you mind, so maybe just touch on the Mideast for us.
Yes.
The Strait is really important. Let's do that one, and then we can go some other places.
Yeah, so if we start with the Middle East, about a third of all urea moves through that strait. A third of all traded urea moves through that strait. So again, if you think about where nitrogen fertilizers are produced, it's where we have abundant natural gas. And so there is significant amount of production of urea in those Middle Eastern countries that move through that strait, or in the case of during the conflict, we're not moving through the strait. We had we think over 500,000 tons of urea that all was stranded behind that strait during the height of the conflict. Saudi Arabia, which produces about 20% of the world's phosphates, 18% of the world's phosphates, they have to bring everything out through the strait as well. So you had significant constraint in phosphates. And then last but not least, half of the world's sulfur exports pass through the strait. And so that's all tied back to oil and gas produced in the industry. It's, of course, a byproduct. Sulfur is an important fertilizer, but it's also that key raw material of sulfuric acid that's used to make phosphate fertilizers all around the world. So Moroccan phosphate production had to be curtailed. U.S. phosphate production had to be curtailed. Russian phosphate production had to be curtailed because we couldn't get that sulfur through the Strait of Hormuz. And perhaps a little fact that most people don't realize, Iran itself is the second largest exporter of urea behind Russia. They have about 11% of total urea production in the world.
And the LNG that's coming out, let's say Qatar or just through the strait broadly, is that going to places where they are in turn then making fertilizer so that LNG itself was also a problem?
That's exactly right. So back to the India example, India has to import all of their natural gas to produce their urea fertilizers, and most of that comes through the strait out of the Middle East. Ammonia, again, produced there in the Middle East from natural gas, goes to Morocco to produce phosphate fertilizers. And some of the North African and European fertilizer plants also get their natural gas through the strait as well. So that also had a significant impact even on fertilizer production outside the region.
So you mentioned, so we've got the strait, which you've touched on. We've got energy prices, which are always important. We've got things like subsidized consumption inelastic, like India.
Mm-hmm.
But then you also have countries, right, where they're either restricting the export or the governments are getting involved and they're not letting the market flow. Do you want to talk about that one a little bit?
Yeah, so the two biggest examples go back to 2021, 2022, and that's when we saw the biggest spike in prices. And at the same time that Russia had invaded Ukraine and then became sanctioned by so many fertilizer consuming countries in the world. The United States was not one of them, by the way, and we can talk about the politics of that if we'd like. And tariffs. We haven't got to tariffs yet. China made a strategic decision, and I say strategic, and I'll give you my conspiracy theory behind this. Why? China decided to restrict all of their exports of their fertilizer. I say all, restrict much of their fertilizer exports. So they're the largest phosphate producer with over 40% of total supply. They control about a third of all nitrogen fertilizer production. And they said, we are not going to participate in the global marketplace because they said they needed it for their own domestic consumer. They're also the largest fertilizer consumer in the world. India's number 2. We're number 3, bouncing back and forth with Brazil. So oftentimes people think, oh, American agriculture is the best in the world. We're still not even the number 1 or 2 consumer. So China said we're no longer going to export our product, and that was what probably had a bigger impact on the market than even Russia invading Ukraine. But because the timing was so strategically done, no one really caught on to that. Media didn't necessarily catch on to that either. They had all their eyes on Russia, and that was where the shiny object was at the moment. Coincidentally, when they have lifted those export restrictions of fertilizer, they will do it in the fall. And why? Because they're sending it to this global south, which is then going into their planting season, the spring planting season, and they're sending it to Brazil. So they produce the fertilizer. They only will allow Brazil to import it. And then China can cut out the U.S. farmer and not buy any of our beans or corn because they can go to Brazil and create a relationship there and do it. So I say my conspiracy theory. I think China knows exactly what they're doing. I think they're manipulating markets. And I think they've especially done a good job inside the United States with social media to turn growers on the U.S. industry to create this fight and blame each other for it, take down the U.S. industry, and then China gets to rule the world. And if China becomes the number one, well, they are the number one, but if they truly take over all fertilizer production, they control food security. And if you control food security, you can control national security. So there's my conspiracy theory for the day.
You know, Corey, one of the things that, with obviously the Strait of Hormuz being closed and reopened, whatever the case may be, some of the things that people are trying to understand now is when markets are going to normalize. I mean, I remember being at a Sarah conference earlier this year, and a Dow CEO came on there and said it could take 12 months for things to normalize. And it was just like, whoa, unbelievable. Everyone focuses on LNG. Everyone focuses on oil. Everyone focuses on oil products. The chemical part of it in the fertilizer situation, people don't really focus too much on that. You're an expert at that. In your opinion or your estimation, like, are we looking at if something happened today, like the Strait open today, how long does it take for this market to normalize, if ever?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I will provide some anecdotes, and then the International Fertilizer Association, which is our sister organization for the world, they actually did some short, medium, long-term actual forecasting with numbers that I won't pretend to have memorized. But I will tell you that we did get some vessels through when that strait was open short term. But we couldn't necessarily get the vessels back in to unload product or to load product. So we had already seen idling of plants. So as a result, even Saudi Arabia, for example, they are trucking urea and phosphate all the way across the continent to go through the Red Sea. Well, you know what just happened there with the Houthis. So there went that supply route. What we don't know is what the damage has been to actual fertilizer facilities that were hit by some of the drones and some of the missiles. We do know that some of them have been completely taken out, and that could take a year, maybe years to bring those back online. And then the of course, oil and gas production that we need for nitrogen fertilizers, but also for the sulfur byproduct too, have been impacted. So that's an even longer term impact. So I do agree. I think it's going to be years before we see normalization of things out of the Middle East, because we just don't have good visibility right now of the extent of the destruction to these facilities. I think the strait opening or closing is an important short-term conversation, but the big impact is going to start in the spring for spring planting when it comes to agriculture. The one comment we've always made, and I've talked with my colleagues about over at API, the American Petroleum Institute, is, you have a somewhat consistent year-long use of oil and gas. When it comes to fertilizer, we have an 8-week window when we need to apply it. And if you miss those windows, you're in a world of hurt. We were able to really get lucky and get through that because of the timing in the spring. But come fall in 2027, I think that's where we're really concerned and worried about.
Maybe I have a couple of questions just tagging on the last, your last point around the impact, if you miss that window to apply the fertilizer. Just help people out. Is there a rule of thumb around yield increase, fertilizer, no fertilizer? Just help us understand, what sort of order of magnitude impact if the fertilizer were not available.
Very broad brushstroke. About half of the yields in the world are due to fertilizer use. So you don't get that fertilizer on the ground, you're looking at wiping out about half of the world's crop yields. Now, obviously, it's not that, direct, but it's extreme, and it won't be evenly felt or impacted. So the U.S. grower, for example, they will find a way to get fertilizer and get fertilizer applied. I don't know that that's going to be the same for a grower in Africa. where that affordability is far more sensitive, and we won't really know what the impact of the spring situation was until we start harvest in the fall.
Well, and we've spent a lot of time talking about, supply side disruptions, supply side flows. Maybe if we step back before this Middle East conflict, just what have been demand trends? What is this disruption kind of fighting against, and what have demand trends been?
Great question. So, we continue to break records on planted corn acres in the United States. And I use that as a proxy because I made the statement earlier that corn is king. That's where over half of the fertilizer is applied in the United States. So even this year, when we had low commodity prices, we didn't plant less corn. So you have a lower price for corn, but we still had the same amount of demand. There are also commodities grown globally that are seeing a spike in price, therefore, invest more in the inputs, but those aren't grown here in the US, but ultimately, they require more demand. So things like palm oil in Southeast Asia, big potash user, they're seeing record prices for that commodity. Canola, we have a little bit of canola, but not a huge commodity in the United States. They're getting very strong crop prices right now. Rubber, coffee. Anyways, these are all crops on the demand side that are having very strong commodity prices, thus requiring more fertilizer. And we're just not seeing the same result of crop prices, row crops here in the United States. And so therefore, demand is high, even if it's not here in the U.S.
I'm curious, is there an analogy, we use, for, our listeners to be familiar, there's this debate around EV versus ICE vehicles, so substitution impact. Is there an analogy in the fertilizer world with the big three or big four that you started out with?
No, so that's the tricky part is there's not really a substitute for those fertilizers. Liebig's law is something we quote quite a bit. You have to continue to apply all three as well as the micronutrients in order to achieve the yields. Now, there are some innovative technologies right now around how to manufacture those nutrients. So enhanced efficiency fertilizers, good nutrient stewardship practices to be more efficient, different ways of manufacturing phosphate from our traditional methods, for example. So there is innovation happening there, but it doesn't take away, there's no substitute for that plant needing phosphate. Where I thought you were going with the EV comment, and I didn't mention with China earlier, is the fact that China is also one of the largest battery manufacturers for electric vehicles. And guess what they use for manufacturing those batteries? Lithium phosphate batteries. And so that phosphate rock that they're mining for fertilizer there is also being kept there to manufacture more batteries.
Corey, I was thinking you said something which really interesting is when you were talking about this whole process, you referenced, so we take fuel, we make fertilizer, the fertilizer makes food, we take the food, we turn it back into fuel. So ethanol.
Yep.
So where is the ethanol discussion and all this? Like my words, not yours or anyone else's, but it seems like that's been a program and a situation that has needed discussing for a long time, but never gets discussed. That, again, my words, but any comment on that? Or is that, are we re-examining what we're doing with ethanol as part of all this?
Well, it's a hot topic here this week because E15 got included in the Farm Bill. And it's a major priority for grower groups. And obviously, I'd say an overwhelming majority of TFI's members would be very happy about that E15 year-round mandate because it means more demand for corn and it'll drive up the price, which at the end of the day, we don't exist as an industry if growers aren't successful. At the same time, because we are so connected with the energy industry. We do have some members, including some mutual friends of ours, that operate refining that have refining operations that are going to, face a detrimental impact as a small refiner from some of the E15 mandates in the Farm Bill. Now, this is way outside of I'm way over my skis on this, but it's a catch-22, right? If you have a fertilizer business and a refining business, it helps you because you can sell more fertilizer, but you may not be in business anymore because of the E15 year-round mandate that's going to hurt your refining business. It's a really complicated issue.
Yeah, it's fascinating. Well, maybe I could, you mentioned the Farm Bill, maybe talk to us about that, what you're watching in it, what the rest of us should know about it. Over to you.
Yeah, I mean, from a Fertilizer Institute standpoint, maybe I can give some good news now. There were several things that we were quite excited about that were included in the Senate language that was released on Saturday, Friday, sometime over the weekend. And, the definitions around biostimulant products to ensure that those are regulated and federally defined as a crop nutrient and not as a pesticide was important. Recognition in some of the conservation programs that farmers use of some of these new technologies, these enhanced efficiency fertilizers, they are able to take advantage of some of those in the new Farm Bill. So those are some of the positive things. Ensuring our ag retail agronomists, who are kind of the farmer's best friend that will help advise them, can be, I'm going to use the word licensed in order to help those farmers qualify for some of those programs, where right now it's very complicated to access those. That's a good positive outcome in the current Farm Bill. On the other side, Mike, back to our previous conversation, there is currently some language that quite frankly surprised us that got in over the weekend that would require mandatory reporting of all prices and sales of the industry. Again, sounds very socialistic. Doesn't sound like a very good free enterprise kind of a policy. At the end of the day, most of that data already exists, so it doesn't necessarily scare the manufacturers. It is a huge administrative burden and a philosophical debate. It's really the ag retailer that we're most worried about there, because they're the ones that are highly exposed, operate on very thin margins, have to take risks well ahead of the season. And if we're putting information out that doesn't explain transportation costs and logistics and bundling of, good practices, that the agronomy practices that may be included, it becomes quite a bit of a disaster, especially for the margin on those ag retailers. So we're working hard to try to get that corrected as the bill goes to the Senate, as the Farm Bill goes to the markup through the Senate later this week.
The U.S. fertilizer industry, how competitive is it globally? Like our ability to produce at a reasonable price?
Yeah, so we're ultimately a net importer of fertilizer. And so I think one of the challenges that we've had in communicating competitiveness is that market share isn't defined by domestic production alone. And so we have 4 major phosphate producers in the United States that make up only 60% of the market. And so we have a total of 18 different phosphate manufacturers that have a piece of the U.S. market share. Unlike, again, crop protection or your John Deere tractor, there are not brands associated to phosphate when it gets applied. It just is a bulk commodity that's stored in a warehouse. They get spread with these giant spreaders out on the field. You have no idea where it came from. No idea who produced it. You just assumed that it's one of these 4 companies in the U.S. that likely did it. And the reality is it's probably not. It's probably one of the other 14 companies outside the United States that also has a percentage of that market share. So potash, very different. We import most of it from Canada. So Canada obviously has a huge penetration in the United States market. We only manufacture less than 2% here, and there are a handful of companies that do that. And nitrogen, completely different story. There are 18 domestic nitrogen manufacturers, well over 50 different nitrogen suppliers that participate in the U.S. market and have U.S. market share.
And that just last one on this, the cost of producing that nitrogen fertilizer, is it on par with what it is to produce in the rest of the world, or how should we think about that?
No, and trade remedy laws is something that's been a hot topic around here because, again, when you think about potash as an example, I'm gonna use that one. That is the Belarusian government largest source of revenue because they own that industry. It is a state-owned enterprise, and so yes, we compete globally against these state-owned enterprises who don't necessarily have to deal with regulatory approvals or permitting requirements or the list goes on and on of some of those challenges. Trinidad's been a really interesting topic lately. So Trinidad's gas supply has been a real challenge for, goodness, I'm going to get this wrong. I think we have 5 of our member companies that are producing some form of nitrogen in Trinidad. One, we had tariffs from IEEPA, the emergency tariffs. We can jump into that here for a little bit, on ammonia fertilizer, as well as sulfur and sulfuric acid. On November 14th, the president exempted almost all other fertilizers from IEEPA tariffs. Fast forward, those exemptions carried forward when IEEPA was struck down and replaced by the 122 tariffs. And now fast forward to a day feels like a year in this town. Was this 2 weeks ago? I can't even remember. The 301 tariffs that came into place. Ammonia and sulfur and sulfuric acid got added to the exemption list when we went to the 301 tariffs. So that now means that Trinidad can now import ammonia to the United States again at 0%. It was at, I think, 10 or 15% prior to 2 weeks ago. So again, all those trade flows had shifted and we were not seeing those nitrogen products coming into the United States because there was a tariff on them. But you have other challenges in Trinidad. You've got the gas supply that I mentioned, and then port access has been another challenge for one of our members down there. So much so, they're actually selling their asset because they have found that the government has not been playing fair with some of those plants. Venezuela, another really interesting story. When United States and I got to be careful what word I used here. Had an intervention. Is that a good word at Venezuela? There's a nitrogen plant down there that received a license to start bringing product into the United States again. That plant, by the way, was owned by a U.S. company before it was taken over by the Venezuelan government. They'll probably never get it back, but we did just see our first ever vessel of Venezuelan fertilizer hit the shore here. So anyways, I'm rambling just to give you examples of the fact that trade and tariffs are definitely having an impact. Countervailing duties is a trade remedy tool that has been used by our phosphate producers in the United States against Russia. Oh, let me tell a Russia story too. Against Russia and Morocco, because of subsidizing of the natural gas to produce some of that product by those state-owned enterprises. So when IEEPA tariffs came out, we called the White House and we said, hey, look, we're going through the tariff list here and we don't see Russia listed. There's no percentage for Russia. And they said, well, yeah, we don't have North Korea, we don't have Iran, we don't have Russia because we don't have a trading relationship with them. And we lean over and we say, Russia's the largest supplier of urea to the United States. And they looked at us and said, why do you fertilizer people have to be the problem every time? And so Russia's market share in the United States doubled because of the IEEPA tariffs. They were the only country that could bring in, Russia was the only country that could bring in nitrogen fertilizers at 0%.
Corey, I knew that the U.S. imported the majority of our potash. I didn't realize it was 98%. And so maybe kind of talk about the relationship we have with Canada. How is that looking right now with the tariffs? I mean, where are we at? I mean, have things gotten worse, better? How do you think things, politically, and is there any is there any impact that we're seeing so far from that?
So inauguration night is usually a fun evening here in DC. And on, what was that, January 21st, I was at the Ag Ball. So all of the ag groups have a inaugural ball. And I was sitting there and one of my Canadian members came over and said he just signed the tariffs on Canada. And this was, again, going right into the growing season. Would you believe that potash then was the subject of 3 executive orders over the course of the next few weeks? I just had to pinch myself that potash was a hot topic being discussed in the Oval Office. I don't know how we got there, but we did. So very quickly, the president exempted all of that potash from import duties when that that all went down very early in the administration. Obviously, the USMCA compliant materials all ended up getting included in that exemption, but that potash piece ended up getting carried forward so much that it applied to the whole world. Anytime there was a trade, a deal, or some sort of a tariff, potash ended up getting exempted. No matter where it was coming from, no matter what tariff we were talking about, it became kind of the golden child of the discussion. So right now, that potash is still coming in at 0%. It continues to be exempted anytime there's, a wildfire tariff or whatever else we're talking about with Canada. I have spent some time up in Ottawa recently talking with their trade negotiators, making sure we protect that relationship, because while we import over 80% of our potash from Canada, we supply that same amount of phosphate back to the Canadian farmers, because phosphate, they don't have phosphate in Canada. So it is a very mutually beneficial relationship.
The last question here. Everyone's focused on sort of gasoline margins, diesel margins, but we really hadn't talked about sort of renewable diesel or sustainable aviation fuel, and how are those industries being impacted by what's going on in the agriculture markets right now?
That's a good question. Probably not something I follow a lot. Other than when those standards were developed, we made sure that some of our products and practices got included in those definitions. Particularly if we were going to be supplying Europe, use of some of the enhanced efficiency fertilizer, the slow release nitrogen products. We also have written a standard for low carbon ammonia production, so that some of these new electrolyzers that would be used as part of that substitution of natural gas for producing nitrogen fertilizers can be calculated and represented in some of these commercial agreements. So Japan, for example, and North Korea have partnered with some U.S. manufacturers to produce low carbon ammonia here in the United States. And we built a standard that the industry can use to calculate that carbon intensity. So those that are moving away from using natural gas as that feedstock can calculate that.
I'm struck by how much all this, rhymes with, things we spend a lot of time thinking, whether it be energy flows out of the Middle East, concentrated supply chains out of China, like uranium, concentrated, fuel for the nuclear, power facilities out of Russia and former Soviet states. So just fascinating. The last two, I'm curious if there's been any change in either China or Russian behavior kind of in the last in the midst of this Iranian kind of battling back and forth? Any change in those postures or flows out of those two countries?
Yeah, really good question. So we haven't talked about sulfur yet, and I think that's an interesting topic. But a couple of things on Russia. One, they put in their own kind of export restrictions, not full export bans, but export restrictions. Putin saw if he wasn't going to be able to supply Europe with natural gas, which, by the way, when they kind of locked down that natural gas, it took down 70% of Europe's nitrogen production, because they had to bring all that natural gas in from Russia. But if he wasn't going to be able to export natural gas, he realized very quickly that if it can be converted into fertilizer, then it becomes a food security issue, and it doesn't get subjected to the same kind of restrictions. So there were some restrictions that went into place in Iran. When Iran broke out, they have started to loosen some of those restrictions. China actually loosened some of their restrictions when Iran broke out, but mainly, again, to supply some of the South American market and some of Brazil. So we have seen a little bit of change in behavior. I think probably the biggest thing that happened, and I don't want to be a geopolitical expert on this, attacks on Russian fertilizer plants actually went up as well during the Iranian conflict. And so there's 10 Russian fertilizer plants that have all now been hit, not destroyed, but hit by Russian drones and Russian missiles. So again, you talk about the irony and how connected all of this is.
Wait, sorry, Corey, would you repeat that again? So that you said 10 Russian fertilizer plants were hit by the Ukrainians?
By the Ukrainians, probably using U.S. missiles that are then going to restrict the supply of the product that was coming out of those plants to go to the U.S. grower. It really is fascinating, because the United States was just about the only country that did not restrict Russian fertilizer. So you still can't bring Russian fertilizer into Canada. They completely sanctioned all that Russian fertilizer. So we are one of the few countries that still was importing Russian fertilizer. So I find it incredibly ironic that we're probably supplying the munitions that Ukrainians are using to hit Russian fertilizer plants that are disrupting the fertilizer for the U.S. farmer. It all blows my mind how connected all of this is sometimes.
So could we ask you, Corey, as you think about the situation you've described with, complexity, incredible disruption, lots of government intervention for all kinds of reasons and in all kinds of ways globally, and then you, of course, have this price rise. What do you, when people in Washington say, okay, well, what could we do that would help this without being, overly interventionist? Like how do you see us? What are the positive steps we could take here?
Yeah, I get a lot of criticism for my answer to this question. And I have to explain to people that sometimes you see things that happen that you don't like, but it sure the heck is better than the bad things they were going to do. And so I'll use a story or an example of that. We were obviously under a microscope. Farmers were very angry at fertilizer companies. They were asking the administration to investigate us, the OJ investigations, FTC investigations. Again, nothing inappropriate there. It's global supply demand that was driving a lot of the market situation. And I sincerely believe the administration understands that, right? They understand global commodity markets and how that works. So what can be done? Not a lot, to be honest. You're not going to be able to go out and influence global markets. So politically, what are some things that they can do to at least help appease some of those constituents, those voters, to deliver the appearance that they're trying to help? And one of those things is to make it to be less reliant on foreign supply and expose yourself to more geopolitical disruptions. Again, I don't know that that's going to shift the marketplace. So we were asked, three of our CEOs and myself were asked to join a meeting with 4 cabinet secretaries. By the way, that just doesn't happen. In my lifetime, I've never sat in a room with 4 cabinet secretaries. And the entire discussion was around how to bolster domestic supply. And it was specifically focused on nitrogen because that was the one that we probably have the biggest competitive advantage to increase production. These plants cost, $4 or $5 billion, 5 to 7 years to build. Permitting alone on a plant from a member company, a CEO that was in the room, took 7 years and $25 million just to permit. And so these stories started to come out, and these cabinet secretaries' eyes just got bigger and bigger and bigger. And so that became a major priority for them. But you have to be careful. Go back to where Mike started this whole conversation around populism and some of those political outcomes. The United States government negotiated a $500 billion with a B dollar fund that is being managed out of the Department of Commerce that was a part of the negotiation with the Japanese trade agreement. And that $500 billion was to be invested in really energy projects. I think 5 natural gas plants have been funded from that fund already. And so one of the objectives was to try to convince Lutnick to take some of that funding, because capital is a challenge, to be honest with you, when you're talking about these large-scale investments. But to take some of that capital, some of that money from that fund, he had $400 billion, I think, left over to still try to spend and invest in fertilizer manufacturing, because it's a natural gas derivative, so it could qualify under the intent of the agreement with the Japanese. The problem is, the problem that our industry saw with it is that fund requires the government to own the asset as you move forward with the project. And there were not many companies around the table that would be willing to allow the government to own that business, and philosophically even have strong objections to the government going out and building fertilizer plants and owning fertilizer assets all around the country. So we appreciated the focus on bolstering domestic supply. We would rather see it done through deregulation, accelerated permitting. Capital is good, but not if it's tied necessarily to government takeover of the industry.
Well, it's been fascinating. I think when we sought you out, we knew this would be a treasure trove of things to talk about. I would say we underestimated it. Well, last question, Corey, as you think about the energy, power, industrial world, technology that our world, are there ways in which our community can be more helpful, more useful, more involved, more engaged? Any thoughts there as we wrap up?
Yeah, I mean, I think obviously one of the strategic advantages that we have as a fertilizer producing country is the business relationship with a affordable and abundant supply of natural gas. And I think just continuing to focus on that business connection, but also policy connection, whatever we can do to support favorable policies to continue that production is going to ultimately benefit fertilizer production and farmers in this country. So spread that message, find those opportunities for us to collaborate and speak as a common voice would be the biggest takeaway I would have.
Corey, this has been awesome. Thank you so much. Look forward to staying in touch, and we feel a lot smarter, but lots to think about in there.
It's amazing how connected our world is in so many ways. Growing up in a small rural Texas town of 1,500 people, Glen Rose, Texas, if you've ever heard of it, I never thought I would be in Washington, D.C. talking about geopolitics with Putin and being on the news every day because the Strait of Hormuz is closed. it just agriculture and the Strait of Hormuz were not on my bingo card.
Well, when you said what was it? Somebody in the White House said it's you fertilizer guys again. Well, Corey, thanks a ton. We really appreciate it.
Thank y'all. Thanks for having me.
Thanks, everybody.